The torchlight caught the edge of her face as the iron door groaned shut behind her. She could still hear the roar of the crowd above, faint now, muffled by stone and earth, but down here, in the bowels of the amphitheater, there was only the smell of blood-soaked sand and the sound of heavy breathing. Not her own. His. The gladiator stood across the narrow cell, still wearing the leather straps that had held his armor moments before. His chest heaved with the rhythm of a man who had just killed 3 opponents in the arena. The lanista, the trainer who owned him, had shoved her inside without a word. She didn't need an explanation. She had been a slave in the ludus for 2 weeks now, and she had learned what silence meant. What it prepared you for. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall, and the gladiator stepped forward. There was no emotion in his eyes. No cruelty. No desire. Just obedience. Just duty. Just survival. Because for him, this too was part of the performance. Part of what kept him alive. The lamp flickered. The door was locked from the outside. And in that moment, she understood that death in the arena might have been a mercy compared to what survival in the ludus actually meant. Before we continue into one of the darkest corners of ancient Rome's machinery of violence, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button if you want more untold stories from history's shadows. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, because these stories deserve to be remembered, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know Roman history, because what we're about to discuss rarely makes it into the textbooks. Now, let's descend into the ludus, the gladiatorial training school, where cruelty was not a breakdown of order, but the order itself. Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era was an empire built on spectacle and submission. From Britannia to Egypt, from Hispania to Syria, millions of people lived under the weight of Roman law, Roman taxes, and Roman entertainment. And at the heart of that entertainment was blood. The amphitheater was where Rome demonstrated its power, not just over foreign enemies, but over life and death itself. The Colosseum in Rome could hold 50,000 spectators. The arena at Capua, where Spartacus once trained, was nearly as large. Pompeii had its own amphitheater, built in 70 BCE, one of the oldest permanent stone arenas in the Roman world. These weren't just buildings. They were temples to Roman dominance, and the rituals performed inside them required a constant supply of bodies. Gladiators were prisoners of war, condemned criminals, enslaved people, sometimes even volunteers who had sold themselves into bondage for a chance at fame or survival. They lived in training schools called ludi, brutal institutions scattered across the empire but concentrated in Campania, near the city of Capua, where the most famous gladiators were forged. The ludus magnus in Rome was directly connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel. Gladiators could be marched from their cells to the arena floor without ever seeing daylight. Archaeological excavations have revealed the layout of these schools: small cells barely large enough to lie down in, communal training yards, kitchens, armories, and punishment chambers. Everything was designed for control. Every door had a lock. Every corridor had a guard. Every hour of every day was monitored, logged, and weaponized. And while historians often focus on the men who fought in the arena, there were others trapped inside those walls. Women. Captives taken in war, daughters of rebels, wives of executed traitors, or simply enslaved people deemed expendable. They were never listed in the official rosters. They were never mentioned in the celebratory mosaics or the poems praising a champion's valor. But Roman legal texts, graffiti, letters, and later Christian condemnations make it clear, they were there. And what happened to them was systematic. Not random acts of violence by individual men, but a mechanism built into the structure of the ludus itself. A protocol. A reward system. A tool of control. The ludus was a machine. Not metaphorically, literally. It was designed to break human beings down and rebuild them as instruments of violence and profit. The lanista, the owner and head trainer, controlled everything. Food portions. Sleep schedules. Punishments. Rewards. Who fought whom. Who lived. Who died. And who was given access to the women kept in the lower cells or the servants' quarters. The lanista was usually a freedman himself, someone who had risen through the brutal hierarchy of Roman slavery to become a businessman. He had investors to satisfy. Contracts with city officials who organized the games. Debts to pay. And his product, the gladiators, had to be kept functional. That meant finding ways to manage their aggression, their despair, their constant proximity to death. Violence couldn't only flow outward into the arena. It had to be redirected, channeled, controlled. And one of the tools for that control was access to the women. Some of these women had been swept up in the aftermath of a military campaign. Perhaps they were from a Germanic tribe that had resisted Roman expansion, or a Dacian village burned to the ground after an uprising. Roman soldiers didn't always kill everyone. Sometimes they took the young, the able-bodied, and marched them in chains back to Rome or one of the provincial cities. From there, they were auctioned. A Lannister buying women for his ludus wasn't looking for labors. He was looking for rewards. Incentives. Tools to manage the violent men under his control. The prices varied. A young woman with no scars and no reputation for resistance might cost anywhere from 500 to 1,000 sesterces, depending on the market. For context, a trained gladiator might be worth 15,000 sesterces or more. The women were cheap. Replaceable. That was the point. Consider a girl we'll call Livia, though that wasn't her real name. Her real name had been taken from her the moment she was captured. She was perhaps 16, 17 years old when she arrived at a ludus just outside Pompeii. She had been part of a small community in the northern frontier, farmers, herders, people who wanted nothing to do with Rome. But Rome came anyway. Her father was killed in the fighting. Her brothers, too. Her mother was deemed too old to be valuable. Livia was young, and that made her a commodity. She was brought south in a slave caravan, sold twice before a Lannister's agent noticed her at a market in Neapolis. He paid 800 sesterces. Not a large sum. Enough for a healthy girl with no scars and no reputation for resistance. She arrived at the ludus in the early autumn, when the games were still weeks away and the gladiators were being drilled relentlessly in preparation. The ludus was a compound, high walls, iron gates, narrow corridors of stone and brick. At the center was the training yard, a rectangle of sand where men sparred under the eyes of their trainers. Around it were the barracks, the kitchens, the army, the punishment cells, and the quarters where the Lannister and his assistants lived. Livia was taken to a small room near the kitchens. It had no window, just a slot high on the wall for air. The floor was packed earth. There was a single oil lamp that was lit only in the evenings. There were two other women there already. One was older, perhaps 30, silent, her eyes fixed permanently on the floor. The other was closer to Livia's age, a girl from Thrace who spoke broken Latin and a language Livia didn't understand. Neither of them explained what would happen. They didn't need to. Livia could hear it at night, the footsteps in the corridor, the opening of doors, the muffled voices, the long stretches of silence that followed. Sometimes there were other sounds. Crying. Pleading. The dull thud of a fist against flesh. Then silence again. The system was simple. After a gladiator won a significant fight, or after a hard week of training, or when the Lannister wanted to reward loyalty or discourage rebellion, access to the women was granted. It wasn't framed as violence. It was framed as privilege. A man who obeyed, who fought well, who didn't complain, might be given an hour in one of those rooms. It was noted in the records the same way rations of wine or meat were noted. A line item. A cost of doing business. Some Lannisti even had a rotation system, certain women on certain days, to avoid pregnancies or injuries that might reduce their usefulness. There were rules. A gladiator couldn't damage the women too badly. Broken bones meant lost productivity. Scars on the face reduced resale value. But beyond that, there were no protections. No one to complain to. No recourse. There was no consent. There was no negotiation. The women were told when to bathe, what to wear, when to wait. Refusal meant punishment, lashes, starvation, being locked in the dark cells where the air was so thin you could barely breathe. One woman, according to graffiti found in Pompeii's gladiatorial barracks, was known by a nickname that translates roughly to the Silent One. Historians believe she may have had her tongue cut out for resisting. Whether that's true or exaggerated, the fact that such stories circulated tells us something about the environment. Fear was the currency. Obedience was survival. Livia's first weeks were a slow conditioning. She was fed enough to stay healthy but not enough to have strength. She was given a tunic, plain and thin, and told to keep it clean. She was taught a few words of Latin, commands, mostly. Come. Wait. Be still. She was shown how to oil her skin with cheap olive oil, how to braid her hair in the Roman style, how to lower her eyes when a man entered the room. The older woman, whose name Livia never learned, sometimes whispered instructions. How to make it faster. How to breathe through it. How to go somewhere else in your mind. Livia tried to remember her home, the hills, the smell of wood smoke and barley, but the memories felt farther away each day, like something from another lifetime. The Thracian girl cried every night for the first week, then stopped abruptly. Livia wondered if she had found a way to escape inside herself, or if something inside her had simply broken. One evening, perhaps 3 weeks after Livia arrived, a guard came and told her to follow him. Her heart hammered in her chest. She looked at the Thracian girl, who turned away. The older woman said nothing. Livia was led down a corridor lit by oil lamps, their flames casting long shadows on the stone. The walls were damp. She could hear men shouting in the training yard, the clang of wooden swords, the bark of the trainers. Then a door opened, and she was pushed inside. The room was small, almost like a cell, but it had a bench and a basin of water. A gladiator was already there. He was tall, heavily muscled, his skin covered in scars, some old and faded, some fresh and red. He had won his last 3 fights. She had heard the other slaves talking about him, how the crowd loved him, how the Lannister was considering entering him in the games at Pompey's main arena. He looked at her the way you might look at a cup of wine after a long march. With expectation. With entitlement. But not with cruelty. That was the worst part. He wasn't a monster. He was a man doing what he had been told was his right. She stood near the door, her hands shaking. He gestured toward the bench. She didn't move. He stood and walked toward her, and she flinched. He stopped. For a moment, there was something almost like hesitation in his face. But then the door opened again, and the Lannister's assistant stepped inside. He was a short man with a thin face and cold eyes. He looked at the gladiator, then at Livia, then back at the gladiator. He said one word in Latin, "Proceed." Then he left and locked the door behind him. The sound of the lock sliding into place was louder than anything Livia had ever heard. What happened in that room is not described in any historical text, because it was never meant to be described. It was understood. Expected. Routine. Livia learned that night that survival meant stillness. Silence. A kind of internal disappearance. She learned that you could leave your body without dying. That you could watch yourself from somewhere far away, as if it were happening to someone else. When it was over, the door was unlocked and she was led back to her room. The Thracian girl was gone, someone else's turn. The older woman was asleep, or pretending to be. Livia sat on the stone floor and stared at the wall until dawn. She didn't cry. Crying required acknowledging that something had been lost, and Livia had already begun the process of forgetting who she used to be. This was not an isolated event. In the months that followed, Livia was summoned again. And again. Sometimes it was the same gladiator. Sometimes it was another. Once it was a trainee, a boy not much older than her, who cried afterward and begged her not to tell anyone. She didn't. There was no one to tell. The Lannister's wife, a Roman matron who occasionally visited the compound to inspect the kitchens or check on expenditures, never came near the women's quarters. The physicians who treated injured gladiators walked past Livia and the others as if they were part of the furniture. Invisibility was the design. The system required that these women exist and not exist at the same time, present enough to serve their function, invisible enough not to complicate the narrative of Roman glory and masculine honor. Some gladiators were cruel. They had been broken so thoroughly by the ludus that the only power they had left was the power to hurt someone weaker. Some were indifferent, mechanical, as if they were simply completing another task on a list. A few were almost apologetic, though apology changed nothing. The women learned to recognize the sounds of the ludus, the rhythms that told them when the men were being fed, when they were training, when punishments were being carried out, and when the doors would open for them. They learned which guards could be bribed with silence and which ones enjoyed the cruelty. They learned that the worst nights were after a gladiator died in training or in the arena, because the survivors were angry and afraid, and fear always needed somewhere to go. Pregnancy was common. The Lannister had a midwife who came once a month, an old woman who had been delivering babies in the slums of Pompeii for 30 years. If a woman conceived, she was given slightly better food, more bread, sometimes a piece of fruit, and kept away from the gladiators for a few months. But only until the child was born. After that, the baby was taken. Boys might be raised as future gladiators or sold to another Lannister. Girls might be kept as future. The fame of the great champions. Because to acknowledge it would be to admit that the glory was built on something Rome preferred to forget. So here's the question we're left with: how many other stories like Livia's are hidden in the archives, waiting for someone to notice the gaps in the records, the missing names, the women who were always there but never mentioned? How many times has history told us about the conquerors and the heroes while erasing the people who had no choice, no voice, no escape? And more importantly, what does it say about us that we're only now beginning to ask these questions, 2,000 years later? If this story made you think, if it made you uncomfortable, good. That's the point. History isn't just about what we celebrate, it's about what we're willing to face. Subscribe to this channel if you want more of these untold stories. Share this video if you think others need to hear it. And drop a comment below telling us which historical figure or dark chapter you want us to investigate next. Because the past is full of voices that were silenced, and the least we can do now is listen. We owe that much to Livia, and to all the others whose names we'll never know.